Perfect. Okay, so welcome back, guys. We are going to keep working on our Get Money Shoes project, which the nice thing is, if you have that repo, we'll just be building right out of it. What we're going to be working on today is setting up an association. So we're going to add another model. We're not going to deal with just one anymore. And then we're going to set up some nested forms in between those two models. And we'll start by just adding to the form that we have to make that nested. And if we have time, we'll also set it up from the other side. So I think the easiest thing to do, and I know it's similar to some of your examples in your labs, which I try to actually give examples that are different, but it's just going to be the easiest option, is to add a category model. So our first goal today is going to be to add a category model so that a shoe belongs to a category. So far, we've just really been making sneakers, but from here on out, we can make all sorts of shoes. So we can have sneakers, we could have sandals, we could have fancy shoes, boat shoes, I don't know. But we're gonna make categories, and then our category will have many shoes. And at the end goal, if we can get there, if not, we might have to add some to tomorrow's lecture. Both forms, we would be able to not only create a new category, but also add a shoe to that category. Or when we're creating a shoe, we can either choose from an existing category or add a new category. So that's kind of our end goal of what we're going to be going for today. And nested forms are a little bit complicated. I just want to put that out there. If you ever find yourself struggling with them, know you are not alone. I think every single student who has gone through nested forms has struggled with them at some point. So just know that they're a little bit tough and a little hard to wrap your mind around. Hopefully today will make it a little bit easier. And I just wanted to extra highlight, I love what I saw in the Slack chat about think of how far you've come, of like, it was only like 2 months ago that you could barely do any coding, and now we're building full web applications. So to get started, let's go ahead and add in another migration. So this other one we did a really old school way while we were starting off. By now, maybe we've learned a different way of writing migrations. When you guys in your projects have to generate a migration, how do you usually go about doing it? Any thoughts?
Rails, G, migration, I mean, and then the name of the migration.
Yep, that's what I do too. I see Ethelbert put resource, so I'm guessing you wanted us to generate a resource. I actually am good with generating a resource. I think it does pretty much the same. It will get our migration as well. So let's go ahead and we'll generate a resource. And this will give us the migration, but it will also give us the model, and it will also give us some routes. And so it'll just be a little bit easier to get started and get it up and running off the ground. And our resource that we're going to generate is a category. And for this category that we generate, we're not going to have a lot of info. We're just going to call it a name. And so we'll say it's a string. And then our category will have many shoes. So we can go ahead and generate this resource. If our category is going to have many shoes and our shoes are going to belong to a category, what will I need to change about the shoes migration? Yeah, well, we're going to need, our shoes right now don't have anything that will allow them to be associated with a category. So we're also going to need to alter this table so that it works with the belongs to. So in this case, we'll take Mike's suggestion and we will say Rails, generate migration. And oddly enough, I forget my syntax for this one more than the resource. That's why I like to use the resource, because it's my more often one. So we'll say Rails, generate migration, add.
I think it would be add category to shoes.
Like this.
I forget if it's camel case or.
Well, we got something. Let's see if it gave us any info inside of here. It didn't give us anything inside of here, but we can fill that in. And so first, that one looks good. And this one, we will need to add a column. I'm gonna have to look this up, unless any of you guys has it in front of you.
It's add column. And then the the table you're adding to, the category ID, and then integer.
Perfect. And if we were doing this as a resource, and so when you get to your project, I actually think it's a really good idea to have all of your things, your models mapped out before you start doing it. And even though we could set it up here where we could make it a belongs to relationship. So we could also write this as category and this say belongs to, but for the sake of simplicity, we'll just leave it like this. But it is really nice and easy when you're starting from scratch to do everything as resource and line it up as it belongs to, because then it will add an index for you as well. So let's go ahead and let's see if both of these work. So let's rake DB migrate and make sure we have our table set up. If it works, we'll get something new in our schema. Come on, migrations. While that is migrating, what else are we going to have to add to set up this association that we want to have between shoes and categories? Where else do we need to add code?
To the model.
The model. And perfect, we do have this set up correctly now, so that looks good. We'll come up to our model. In our shoe model, what do we need to add here? I feel like these are, I'll go ahead and do, yeah, you got it, Nethelbert. I was like, I think you guys know this part. When I write belongs to category, because I just think this is really important to emphasize, what are a few methods that this one keyword gives us? So it gives us some instance methods. Can anyone tell me what are, just list off a few instance methods that it gives us? So like a second ago, we could call like @shoe.brand_color. And we could probably call @shoe.brand, and we could call @shoe.price. Now we also have, if I can spell it correctly, we have a reader method called category. We now, and these are all instance methods, we now could call an instance method called category equals to use a writer method. We can do a build category method. That's another one that it gives us. Let's write this on another line because they're getting close together. We also get a category, and this actually comes from more than migration, but we'd have a category ID and a category ID equals. We'd also have, you know, a .create category method. And I just really like to emphasize that it's this relationship here that is giving us, well, actually, this one really comes from the database, but is really giving us these that we have here. And there are a few others, but these are going to be the ones that are going to be most important to us as we move forward. From the other side, since our category can have many shoes, and just to emphasize, it does matter plural versus singular. So if you're having many of something, we name it plural, we follow that convention. And if it's singular, we name it singularly. This one is going to actually give us a few extra methods, because remember, category in our database doesn't know anything about shoes. If we just looked at the category table, it doesn't have any information about our shoe. And so for category, this is gonna give us a few extras. So it's gonna give us a shoes method that will return an array of shoes. It will also give us a shoe IDs method, which will return all of the shoes IDs. Now I'm actually singular or plural. I actually don't remember off the top of my head. Shoes IDs, shoe IDs. I don't know. And then it will give us one or the other setter method for those as well. And then we'll have the build and the create like we did before. But I just like to emphasize this is where we're getting extra methods, because this is a macro that will give us extra methods. And there's Ruby documentation you can always look up that would give you the correct, if that's plural or singular, and that's killing me that I can't remember off the top of my head. We'll see as we go forward. So now that we have this set up, we should be able to, let's just test it out. In our console, we should now be able to associate one thing to another. So let's start by just making sure we can create a category. So we've done a lot of sneakers. So let's create a category called sneakers. You might call them tennis shoes. I feel like that's a very regional thing, what everyone calls them. So now we have a category, and now we can, hopefully, if we've done this correctly, we can associate all of our shoes to this, and we can do our association in more than one way. So we could take a shoe. So let's just grab the first shoe. And we now have this option for category ID. And so we could go in and we can say category ID equals 1, because that was our first category. And we can save that shoe. Now, if we've saved that shoe correctly, our category, which I think I did save as a C, right? Yep. We should be able to access category.shoes and see that we've got 1 in there. Looks good. We've got a solid association. We should also be able to say s.category and get back the first category. So we have this mutual relationship here between the two. We can also make this association by saying something like c.shoes, and we could add to c.shoes. And I maybe just want to add the shoe. I'm going to add the second shoe. Why not? And here you'll notice, which I just love to show, that which is really interesting, is it went ahead and it actually updated our database when we did that command. The reason it updated our database was because our category table can't hold information about shoes. We had to update the shoe table to remember information about that category ID. So if we now were to look at c.shoes, and actually we already see the return value right here, we would get a return value of 2 shoes in that same category. A third way you can set up the relationship, and it's very similar to the first way we did, is I could find, let's find the third shoe, why not? Is going to be shoe.third, if I can spell third right. And our third shoe, I also actually didn't realize that you could do this first, second, third for a really long time, and so I think it's pretty neat. I think it only goes up to like 5th maybe, but you can do it for a few of the first ones. And then there's a random number somewhere else that you can access, but I always forget what it is. And then third shoe, we can actually, last time we set the category ID, we also just have a category equals method, so we could just set the category equal to a category, with the difference being we don't set it to a number this time, we actually set it to an object. And we would have to save as well if we do that. Third shoe.save. And we now can look back at our category and we should see 3 shoes in there. Perfect. So we've got our first 3 shoes that have associations in there, which is going to be really nice and helpful as we go through this today. Also, just to clean up our database and make our life a little bit easier, I think I'm going to go ahead and delete the shoes that don't have a belongs to relationship, because I just think it might make our life a little bit easier. So we'll delete if the shoe.category ID equals nil. See if that will work. No, there is a delete. I've done something like this before. Just delete by. It's okay. Cool. I know I could select them and then delete all that I've selected, but we'll skip it and we'll just go forward with it. Some of these shoes.
Could you just say like shoe.all bracket 3..-1 yeah, and then like, yeah, that's what, yeah, that kind of thing.
Well, I need to
I don't know if you would have to do each do shoe destroy.
I know, I'm not sure either. Let's do it just to be safe. It's going to drive me to do this in one line and do it with a do. Shoe.destroy. Perfect. And now we should not have as many shoes. And all of our shoes have categories. Perfect. This just makes our database a little bit cleaner as we go forward, because I didn't want us to get weird errors because we had some things that didn't have categories. One thing that I do also want to point out before we go forward with our forms is that when you write belongs to category, there is a built-in validation, and that built-in validation is checking to make sure you have a category ID. And so it wasn't there before, which is why I wanted to get rid of the ones that didn't already have a category ID. But this will add, it will not save something if it says belongs to category. One of the number one issues that I've seen students run into is they can't figure out why whatever they're making doesn't save. And usually it's because they said belongs to user and forgot to associate it to the user. Or they had some sort of belongs to relationship that they forgot to then create the association to. So just keep in mind this, and I'm going to even just make a note of it because I think it's so important. This has a built-in validation for presence. It must exist. You can turn it off if you want to. You can add some keywords that say optional true. It's not really a best practice to do that because usually if you've done a belongs to, you need it to. There are some rare examples where you might want it to be flexible. It could belong, it might not belong. In that case, sure, go for it and add optional true. I just like to make sure that we're aware of that. So now let's get to the meat of this and let's build a nested form. So if you remember, we've got, I can't see this with my Zoom tools, but we have this already created and we should have only a few shoes now. Perfect. Why is it showing it 3 times? I must have added something weird in my index that does it 3 times. Oh, I did, to show us 3 different ways that we could do the same thing. Okay, that's fine. And if we go to shoes/new, as long as it wasn't an error showing up, this is the form that we're going to want to edit, and we're going to want to add the ability to select a category. And so first thing I like to do is we're going to do it without the nested form. We're just going to allow them to choose from a drop-down because I think it's important to see both as we're associating things. So here's our form we already created. And what we want to add to this today is we want to add the ability for them to select a category. And so in our label and our field, now we have to do ones that will allow us to do a drop-down menu. I should have already had this pulled up, but that's okay. I want to show you guys the collection select documentation. I think I share this out with a lot of people quite frequently and talk about it. When you are doing a collection select with a form with or a form for, and you go to the documentation because you can't remember the syntax, which is what I do a lot of times, if this ever loads, it's going to show you that we can avoid one piece of this. Okay, well, while that's loading, we're going to go ahead and write it out because this is really taking forever. So instead of a number field, we're going to do a collection select, and we'll see the syntax for it in a second. But essentially, the way that it's going to go is our first thing that we're going to list in our collection select is the name of an attribute. And the name of the attribute of the table that we're going to want this to be associated to. So because we can't actually send objects through a form, we can only send IDs through the form. This is going to be called category ID because that is an attribute on the table and we can easily send an integer through a form. The next piece that we're going to do is, finally is up. What I wanted to show you is in all examples, you're going to see this first thing that says object. And even in the examples down here, the first thing they're going to show is the object. If you are using f.collectionSelect, your f has taken care of the object. So documentation-wise, you start here. And that's where we've started with our category ID. So we start with the attribute that we would call this collection select, which is category ID. The second piece, as we can see from here, is we're going to call the collection. So in this case, it would be all categories. The next thing that we do is actually what we want to send through in the params. So the value of the param that gets sent through. And this always ties back to our collection. So it's not the ID of our shoe, it's the ID of our category. And then the next piece that we will do is actually what displays. Again, what displays is going to be an attribute of our category. And so in this case, it would be name. I just know that these can be a little bit tricky. And so I like to emphasize that when you see these, the text method and the value method are talking about your collection, whereas this method is talking about the object that your F is for, or that your form is for. Because I know that these can be a bit difficult. And then we'll change this to say category ID. Let's take a look at how that looks, if it gave us anything. Cool. Notice, even though I misspelled this, Rails is pretty smart, and they didn't think we would want to display ID right here. They know that we will use that for our records to center the ID, but they go ahead and they actually strip off that underscore ID and just display category there for you. Do you guys know how to make it so that I don't see sneakers first, but I just see a blank here?
I think it's like, is it prompt and then like a hash symbol and then I want to say select or something?
Yeah, so there's a few different options because you can like specify your prompt, or you can just say prompt as true, or you can say include blank as true. But you're right on the money, and we even have an example of it right here. And so the last thing that you can add are optional extra fields. Oh, that looks weird. And so we'll add a prompt so that it isn't automatically selected. So it gives us an opportunity to select our sneakers. Beautiful, this is looking great so far. When we submit this form, so we'll make sneakers because that's the only option that we have right now. We'll say brand new. I think I have all of my protections still on here, so we'll have to call these jet black. And we will go ahead and submit these. Actually, did I leave on? Oh, that is interesting. I might have a merge conflict we're gonna have to deal with later, but don't worry about that. I could have sworn I did a pull after I did my merged pull request, but maybe I didn't merge the last pull request. So we don't have any validations, which actually will be a little bit easier for us today. When I create this shoe, if I click this button, have I set up enough for my category to work yet? Just by adding it here in the form. Not yet. In Sinatra, this might have been enough, depending on how you're handling your params. But in Rails, there's always one extra step. Anytime we add something to our form here, it's going to be really important that we also add something to our controller. So if I jump over to our controller, our shoes controller, what do I need to change? This is, okay. What do I need to change to my create method? I'm missing one thing.
Need to add the category ID to your permit.
Exactly. So we need to add our category ID to our permit. And I know that this part can get a little bit confusing because if you can select more than one, it looks a little bit different with the array. If you're ever unsure, you can always throw in a binding pry and look at your params. And then the other thing, and I know I showed you guys this yesterday, I just am such a huge fan of it, is this console is huge when you're being a developer and you need to figure out what your params are going to be. They'll tell us right here what our param will get sent through as. So we'll see it's just a simple, this one we're still simple, it'll be category ID. As we move on and make this a nested form, it'll be a little bit more complex. And so we'll just allow for a category ID to be sent through. And this should correctly make it. We'll see. We don't have an if, it doesn't save. So we can't see it here. So let's just add the ability to see it. So on our show page, let's just add a category. And this is where I think like one study group a long time ago, I tried to do something and it didn't work, and that was use the try method. This is an area that I think is really useful for using the try method, because if we wrote out category.name and category was nil, this would throw a no method error. So this is a place that I like to add the try. So it's like, try to do it, but if it calls a no method error, ignore it and don't worry about it, is what this syntax is saying. We don't have to stress about it because we deleted all of ours without categories. But if we had one in the system without a category, this would be really important code to add. And so if you're doing an optional true or something like that, you want to make sure that your code doesn't break for the cases where this relationship does not exist. So it looks like it works. We got a category sneakers. That looks good. That should be the same as like our first ones that we added by hand. Looks good. So we're on a roll. Now let's make it a little bit more complex. I don't want sneakers. I want to add a different kind of shoe. So I want the ability to add my own category here. So I want to be able to say, and we're going to even just add a header here, or create a new category to make it really clear. And then we're going to go ahead and build this down here. And so when we create a new category, this is where we get to nested forms. And what I want you guys to think about is a nested form is truly just a form within a form. And so we start off similar to how we've started off any other form field we want to add, any other collection, select, number field, text field. We'll start with F, and then we are now going to have our form inside of a form. So we'll say fields for, which is saying that we're making a second form. And then we'll specify what we want these fields to be for. Here should always go the associated object. And so in this case, we are making fields for a category. We will still set it up like the last one where we put a do block and we have an iterator. We can't use F again because that was already taken. So sometimes you'll see people write this as like category fields, or maybe CF for short, or just C. We'll call it a cat field for now to make it really obvious what we're doing. And then because this is a form inside of a form and we wrote a do block, we need a matching end. So this is how I always start by setting it up. It's not going to really change anything right now. So we'll just see, or create a new category, but we haven't broken anything, which is good. It knows that this is an associated object that we can deal with. Inside of here, good news is you don't have to learn anything new. We're going to write out our text fields exactly how we have before. So I can actually copy and paste almost any of these and come in here and drag and drop. I don't know why those were over there like that, but that's okay. And then we'll replace this instead of color. It's now like we're on a category field. And I actually, sometimes I like to have the category form built first, and I just show you can literally like drag and drop that form into here. And then we'll change it for what we want for a category. So this will be an attribute of our category. And then this part is going to have to change to match what's in the block. So if you kind of have the right indentation and it's set up correctly, you should be able to see that inside of your do and end, all of these fields are going to be the same as what we've put in our block to set this up. Now, this should display, but we're not quite done with it yet. And so I wanted to go ahead and display it, and then I'll show you why we're not quite done with it yet. So first, let's take a look at what it looks like here in the parameters. So we get shoe category name. That looks pretty good. I'm curious though, and we'll see. Remember how before I told you these forms are pretty smart, and if we put random things, they usually won't work? Let's see if it works with something random. It does work with something random, which is a hint in my mind that my form isn't actually associating this field with an object. It's just kind of letting me do what I want here. So we'll put it back to name because it should look right. And so this is right now pretty flexible, and we could call it whatever we want. We want it to actually be using Rails's built-in checks to make sure that this is accurate data and a nested form field. To do that, we have two options. The first and the easiest option is just to add accepts nested attributes to our model. So if any of you guys are there yet, you've probably had a little bit of practice doing this. There are a few other ways for something like really simple like this. You might have seen, you can actually make your own reader and writer method. So we could have made, you know, like a category name equals method. Because we won't really do this most of the time, I'm not going to bother kind of working you through it, but the labs will take you through those steps to hopefully help you see how accepts nested attributes works, hopefully. But at any point we can talk kind of through questions of how accepts nested attributes works. So when we put this on here, this is a macro, and it is creating a method for me, and we'll specify what we're doing it for. Does anyone know what method that this creates for me? Yeah, it creates this method that is basically a setter method called category attributes, where it accepts, you know, basically our attributes, and it is going to build our category. And it's going to make sure that both our category and our shoe know about each other, and it's going to create a brand new category based on these attributes that get sent in. So that's what this line of code is doing. This is a macro that is going to build this out for you. We have the ability to build our own method out if we want to, but for right now, let's just look at the plain one that they give us. So once we write this here, I'm going to refresh this form, and something really interesting happens. Did you guys see what happened there? What changed on my form once I added accepts nested attributes for? Yeah, because each of the name is gone. This is like this might be too hard of a question to ask, but I'm going to ask it anyways. Does anyone know why that name field has disappeared, or anyone have a hypothesis?
Is it because the person hasn't typed in a category yet, so it cannot display anything yet?
Kind of. It doesn't have, it doesn't, if we were to put in a binding pie, like our shoe doesn't have an associated category with it. And because our shoe doesn't have an associated category, it doesn't display anything there. And so this is where you guys might have seen it a few times. And there's some different opinions on where we want to like build this at times. But this is where we actually have to come in here and we have to give it a template to use. So if you kind of like, it might be easier actually to explain it with a little bit like our form with or our form for. When we first built form 4, we had to give it a blank shoe so that it knew to associate each of these with our shoe. Now that it knows that category is actually an associated object, it needs a blank template of category in order to create these associations. Just like we needed a blank template of shoe. And so we can come in here and we can do shoe.build category so that now the shoe does have an associated blank category. So we've got a blank slate to work off of. And if I refresh this, some beautiful Rails magic happens and our name field pops back up. I also believe, and I just want to test this, that if I put some gobbledygook in here now, we might get an error message. Fingers crossed, yes. So now it actually is associating this with an object. And because it's associating this with an object, it's expecting these fields to be attributes of that object. And so it's a little bit stricter on our form of, okay, this is actually an association. Let me put in some protection to make sure we're only using attributes that actually belong to that table. So it has some cool protections that we add in there. The last piece that I really like to show you guys before we do anything in the params is what this looks like now. So I don't know if you remember what it said before, but before it just said shoe, category, name. Now it says shoe, category attributes, name, which is like a nod or basically a hint that it is now going to be using this method created by our accepts nested attributes for. So this has added a new setter method that is going to be used when we set our params, because it's changed our params to now call that method. And so one thing I would like to tell you, if you ever have trouble on nested forms, inspect your page regularly. And if you don't see the underscore attributes, that means that something else isn't set up correctly. Either in your model, you're missing accepts nested attributes. In your controller, you haven't instantiated a blank copy of the associated object, or in your form, maybe when you did fields for, something went astray. So this looks good. There is one lab, and I just like to point this out, where they actually have you write category attributes here. I'm a big fan of not doing that because sometimes you actually can have a mistake and think that it's worked correctly and you don't have anything set up. If you do fields for category, Rails has to work its behind the scenes magic to find and make sure that you've set up the association to change it to category attributes. So that's why it's like, to me, it's an extra check if I leave it as fields for category, personally. Now, the last piece that we are going to want to have set up is we are going to need to add something to our controller. And so this part can get a little bit tricky. We're going to need to add another parameter. And this one, we haven't done it yet, so let's just put a binding pry in so that we can look at our params. So we'll go ahead and fill this out. This is because I don't know a lot of shoe brands. Let's say good, hot pink. We're getting some high heels that are gonna be from Steve Madden. And we'll go ahead and we'll click create shoe and hopefully end up in our pry. Perfect. I was afraid for a second I hadn't added a pry. And we can see in here that I thought it was going to already tell us we have some unpermitted parameters. But if we were to look at our params, we will have some unpermitted parameters, but this is what I'm really looking for, is for us to see how our params are coming through. And so we can see that we're getting category attributes. So I'm pretty much going to copy and paste that into our code. And the one thing that's a little bit different about this is category attributes is itself pointing to a hash. Whereas before they weren't pointing to a hash, they were just pointing all to the value. And so in this case, we will actually want this to continue to point to its hash to allow in name. And so we set it up. You can actually just write it like this, but most people, you'll see it with the brackets around it just to specify. You do have to have the brackets if it's has many relationship, but on the belongs to side, they're optional. So I just put them in every time because they work both ways and they work for both situations. So I always just write it like this. Do take note, this is singular because we belong to one category. If we were going the opposite way and this was a has many, it would be categories attributes. And so that singular versus plural convention is going to matter a lot when you're dealing with, whenever you're dealing with nested forms. So check that always. If you get stuck on something, it's usually like an extra S or something like that in your parameters. So that should accept it to go through. Let's actually just test it by copying and pasting this code. Okay, it committed our transaction and it gave us a new category ID, which is really exciting. And you can see here it created a category and then it created a shoe, which is really nice. And then it didn't know what this was anymore because we we hijacked the form. That's okay. Let's see if we just can click create again. There we go. And so we now have this new category of high heels, which is pretty awesome. Actually, let me ask you guys. This is set up pretty well to work. We do have a few issues with it. Does anyone know or could predict what might be an issue that occurs? Let me actually make us an index action for categories, because this will help a little bit. This should be maybe giving you a hint as to what issue we might have. We'll have more than one issue, but this will be one of them for sure. Nelson's got something out there. Yes. So Nelson said uniqueness. Can you expand on that? What do you mean, Nelson?
To add a validation check to the categories model so there's not repeated categories.
So what's going to happen is every time that accepts nested attributes method runs, it always, no matter what, is going to make a new category. And at the moment, I think we're going to be okay. I think we're just going to have 2. Oh no, we did get 3. I wasn't sure if both of those went through. But basically, every time we fill that out, we're going to get a new category here. And so really quickly, it's going to kind of be a mess. Because if I wanted to be able to say something like, let me see all of the shoes in the sneakers category. Well, we don't want to have sneakers twice. Like that is kind of a pain, or we don't want to have high heels twice. And if I go back to my shoes and I was to do another one, and we're going to fill this in quickly. Let's do another sneakers. And we can say, doesn't really matter for any of these. I already have a lot of pink shoes in here. And we click create shoes. We're going to end up with an issue of now when I go back to categories, we're going to have 2 sets of sneakers, and that just is going to get really messy really fast. And it's a really common thing that I see. And so what it means is that we now need to do exactly what Nethelbert said, and we are going to create our own way of handling it, because the one and only issue, in my opinion, with accepts nested attributes is accepts nested attributes does not ever find something, it always creates. So if we want to do find or create by, we have to set our own category or our own thing. There are other ways to work around this. So you could potentially do a validation in the category side that says it must be unique. And you could send them an error saying like, that category has already been created, please choose from the drop down. That's like maybe if you don't want to mess with your own unique one, you can definitely do it that way by using validations. I'm a big fan of at least trying to set up our own unique one. So let's create our own. And I also just want to point out, it's always one or the other. You don't include both. So because really this one would just be overriding the piece brought in by the macro. So we do one or the other here. And what this is basically in our method, when we try to create the shoe with the params, this method is going to be called, and we're going to be given any of these attributes. So I'm just going to go ahead and put a binding pry here because I think it's really important to see. The dog is not happy that he's not in the room that I'm in right now. That's okay. And we'll go ahead and do shoes new. And then I want us to stop in the binding pry. One thing to note, we haven't broken anything as long as this still looks the same. And it does, we still get category attributes as something that's valid because we have set our own custom writer method. That takes the place of our accepts nested attributes. So we can go fill these out. We'll just choose anything that's already in here, and we'll do sneakers. So we can do a find or create by. We should be in our pry, And so just to give you, I think this is like the only way to work with these custom ones is to stop in the pry just to see what's inside of here. And notice the code that we're going to get is just the code that was in our original, that was in our category attributes hash. So we're only going to get what category attributes was pointing to, which is really useful. So then in here, we can use the code that Nethelbert told us, and we can call category and do a find or create by. And find or create by is pretty nice because we can set our attribute, our name, and then say attributes name. So if you see in here, if we do attributes name, we'll get sneakers back. So we'll go ahead and set that here. Now, category attributes was doing some other work besides just this. So it's going to be pretty important that we also include that other work. And what I mean by that is we need to also associate that this category is the shoes category. This isn't just like a random category. And so we would need to say that this shoes category is what's found or created by. When we're in an instance method, how do we access the current shoe? You know, we say current user a lot, but in an instance method, how do we access that current instance? It's a keyword. Oh, I see it in the chat, self. So we can call self.category and set it equal to what this is found. I also do just want to point out that this right here that I've put in here, well, this doesn't have attributes. Wait. It does. Oh, but this is basically the same as actually writing it out up here because attributes name is going to end up being sneakers, and this is just the notation to point as like a hash. So the other way that you could write this instead of being as explicit is we could just say attributes. And I'll show you that this works here just as well. We can do category find or create by, and thankfully it found the first one. It didn't create a new one. So attributes is actually just sending in name pointing to sneakers. So it works either way. Similar to a Sinatra, how we would, when you had like nested params, you could just send in those params. So then we have our category set up, and this should work as long as we fill out the form correctly. And I give that if because I'll show you what I mean. So let's go back here, and I don't think it's created it yet, so let's just click create shoe. That looks good. Let's make sure we didn't get a new category, which actually I think we can do by going to the form. Yep, so these are the 4 that we had before we filled that out. So it actually found a sneaker this time, which is really useful. There is still one place that this might break down. And the place that this is going to break down is what if we leave this blank and I select from my list? Prediction as to what might happen. I love predictions before I create this. Anyone on here, there's a lot to, what do you think is going to happen when I click create shoe?
It might break because you don't have anything in your category, and category attributes the method you just made. It's basically saying creating a category from the attributes, and that's going to be nil. So I don't think you can create a category with name nil. I think it has to have a name.
Oh, you brought up a good point. We don't have any validations here. So let's just say validates name presence. True, because we don't want blank categories. But so we're gonna have some issues when this happens. So let's go ahead and let's create our shoe, and we end up with no category, which is an issue because we're supposed to belong to a category and that's supposed to be required. I'm actually surprised it didn't give us an issue with that. But what ended up happening was we still were like setting our category equal to something. We ended up setting it equal to nil. Like we were overriding our original set from the dropdown. So it's really important, even if you're using this or if you're doing it this way, that you're actually checking to make sure something was filled out. So we could add a little check that says like if, and it depends what you care about. Here we only care about the name. So we can say if it is blank or if it is empty, or if it is not empty, create it. If it is empty, just do nothing. And the reason why we want it to do nothing is because the drop-down menu will have already been chosen. And my preference is that the fill in the blank gets preference over the drop-down. So if they do both, this will still apply. If they leave the fill in the blank blank, the drop-down menu will apply. So it'll be like a one or the other situation. If we were to do this for accepts nested attributes category, the way that looks is, because I want you to have it as a reference, is we add this like reject if proc, and we can set it up. We could say like attribute if our attribute name is blank. And honestly, I probably should use the same for both. But so in that way, it's doing the same thing. This is how you reject them if they're blank for accepts nested attributes. This is how you reject it if it's blank, if it's a custom writer. So we'll go test this because it's easy to talk about. It's a little bit harder if it doesn't actually stand up to it. And we don't need to fill out all of these, so let's just put in a few things. We'll go ahead and click create shoe. It looks like it worked and rejected our blank one, which is great. And then what we also want is that if we do both, that it takes our category over the other one. So that one we'll put sneakers. What's a new kind of shoe? How about sandals? You spelled, yeah, does that look right? I think so. We'll call them rainbows, and they are used in brown. We'll go ahead and create our shoe. And so I think I spelled sandals wrong, didn't I? No one caught me on that. Spelling is not my forte. And then we'll see that we have been able to overpass the drop down if this is filled in. This always happens in nested forms. It takes way longer than I want it to, and we didn't even get to cover the other half, which I think we could fit in for part of the study group tomorrow. But I just want to make sure we don't leave here with any questions about things that we've done so far. So we've got 5 minutes left. Are there any main questions?
I have a question. I'm just curious about when the category is created. Do you create the shoe and then create the category, or does it all like happen at the same time?
I think as we saw it in that other one, it actually looked like it was creating the it looked like it was creating the category first. Yeah, so because it needs the category to then create the shoe.
Right.
So it was creating the category first, and then as it's going through the parameters and then creating the shoe.
So when you say like self.category, that's like the shoe object, but it hasn't been saved into the database yet?
Yeah, it's like an instance of it in existence, but not the instance that's in the database.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Another quick question here. So what we used earlier, we used the collection select.
Yes.
And then we also had a separation between the collection select and the, when we're inputting in like a new category, right?
Correct.
Is it possible, and maybe we could probably try it later, maybe not today, but later.
I think I know what you're going to ask. Yes, go for it.
The data list.
Oh. Yeah, I don't really love the data list, but I'll put that on the back burner, and maybe we can talk about it in the future.
Okay.
I don't know why I don't like the data list, but sure, we can cover that in another one. Does someone for me want to just, because I want to make sure this sinks in, there's a lot that you have to do with a nested form. Does anyone feel confident that they could give like a quick recap of what are the things you need to change if you want to have a nested form? Like what are the things you need to add to make a nested form? Anyone feel like they can give part of that recap?
I would love to give it a shot. I might mess up.
That's okay. That's okay. Thank you for volunteering.
I'll give it a shot. Okay. So what we'll need for nested form in this situation, what we have here is shoes. And we, at the very beginning, said that a shoe belongs to a category, right? Okay. So we said a shoe belongs to a category. And what we decided to do was make a form within inside the shoe. And then we said, okay, now we need to kind of associate it with the category. So what we're going to do is make another form, but within inside of the same form for shoe. So what we decided to do, instead of using form 4, form 4, we decided, or form with, we decided to use fields for, right?
Yes.
And in fields 4, there's certain, I guess, parameters and arguments that it takes. And we said, okay, since we're saying F to symbolize the shoe model, for now we're going to say that's actually going to take over the first portion, which is the model, or is it the object?
Yeah, the object. Yeah.
The object for field 4, that takes over for that. So then we call the attribute, which acts as the method on that object. Correct. And then at that point, we're able to say the do and kind of iterate, in a sense, over it, right? So we call it cat field for category field. And now we're able to just call out the attributes that belongs to the category field.
Perfect.
And when we do that association, we're able to get, the things that we need to get, which is the text field. Now we have to go ahead and make some other changes into our, stuff there. So we have to go into, I believe we have to go into the into our controller, because the parameters we have to kind of make sure is able to accept it, right? And that's where category attributes come into play. And then we had to go into our model and either create the micro accepted one, nested attributes, or our own setter. And we did that right there. And we were able to associate it with inside of the setter directly to our shoe.
Perfect. Very well put. Those are all the pieces. So keep in mind, it's going to be the model. Oh, there's one other little piece, and I forgot about it. It will be the model, the controller, and the view that we update. There's one other thing in the controller, and I almost blanked on it too. What's the other thing we had to add in the controller?
Talking about in the new route, the @shoe.build category.
Ah, yes, the template.
Yes, so we need this just to like have a blank copy of our category that's associated with the shoe. Yes, perfect. Nice work, guys. Thanks for hanging in for that. I'll talk to Chris, and I think maybe tomorrow it might be more important to go over the other half of nested forms, like the has many side, and then also do a little bit of helpers as well. So see if we can fit it all in.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys, for being here. Have a good one.